Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha with Ice Cream Fitness here, and it is time for part 2 of the Monday Q&A. But hold on, let me give you guys a bicep shot first. Yeah, let's get right into these questions. Alright, first question. Can you get stronger without gaining size? Yes, absolutely you can, and I covered quite of that in my whole playlist that I have started on why I don't believe in the hypertrophy rep range theory. I go into some further detail on that, but yes, absolutely. Particularly initial strength gains on a strength training program tend to be neural. There tend to be other things that are going to be too complex for me to get into as far as slight structural differences between angles and muscle tissue, but there are non-hypertrophy adaptive processes to increase strength and power. However, they tend to be very short-lived. At a certain threshold, and it happens relatively quickly, all of the further strength that you gain on a given system of training is going to have to be through tissue hypertrophy, through actual myofibrillar hypertrophy of the muscle fibers. So the answer is yes, but not indefinitely, meaning you're going to reach a wall to where you have to get bigger to get stronger. You simply aren't going to see 175-pound powerlifters with 2,000 plus pound totals or 2,500 totals. You have to get bigger to get stronger. Alright, next question. Why are refeeds done with carbs? Will I be getting the same benefits if I just up my overall calories the same amount that I was just going to do with just carbs? Thanks, man. There's a couple of reasons. No, you can't just increase overall intake because you will potentially gain more fat on your refeed. What you have to keep in mind is that the higher your dietary fat goes when you eat a surplus of calories, the more of your dietary fat gets stored as body fat. And when you eat a lot of carbs, your body tends to burn carbs for fuel and it stores your dietary fat. So, and what you also find is that large caloric surpluses from carbs only for a short period of time do not always convert into body fat at any rate. So sometimes you can get away with ultra high calorie, high carb refeeds if your fat is dropped rock bottom for a single day or a single evening, and sometimes there's very minimal de novo lipogenesis, meaning you don't always gain the amount of fat you should have gained for the caloric surplus. But multiple days of high carb overfeeding will definitely ramp up de novo lipogenesis and you'll start storing carbs as fat. But a single half day or a single day usually isn't enough to cause a significant amount of it. And that's particularly true when you're depleted. You have a much, much bigger threshold. And that goes back to the other point of you tend to be glycogen depleted when you're in a caloric deficit and your training performance tends to stall, and therefore you lose muscle easier. When you're depleted, if you do a high carb refeed, the carbs tend to store all as muscle glycogen. They tend to supercompensate, which gives you larger glycogen stores than you would normally have for a couple of days. And so what happens is that gives you better training performance. It creates a better anabolic environment for your future days that are going to be in a deficit so that you retain muscle better. And if you're retaining muscle better, you're burning less muscle, which means the calories have to come from somewhere. It comes more from the body fat. So you lose more fat, you keep more muscle. Now, the other thing is that lower carb intake is associated with a reduction in T4 to T3 conversion in your thyroid hormones. And so by eating the higher carbs, you re-speed that back up. It gives you a slight thyroid advantage that you wouldn't necessarily get from loading other macronutrients. So it is important that you keep your carbs very, very high on a refeed and you drop your fat very low. Actually below oftentimes what you might take in on a normal cutting day on your diet. Alright, next question. Your opinion on knees caving in the squat. I've heard many different things, weak glutes, weak hamstrings, weak abductors, etc. And this comes from one of the younger powerlifters who trains at my gym actually. And this comes down to a couple different things. Oftentimes it is a hip weakness. If there's a muscle weakness involved, it is the hips that's going to cause the knees to cave in. And even if you have other performance elements causing it, if your hips are strong enough, it can prevent the knee cave in to some extent, even if there is something else to blame. Now, it can also be a sign of lack of glute activation through technique, meaning you're not sitting back hard enough. You don't have your foot position right. You have something wrong that is preventing you from engaging your glutes correctly. And sometimes you have to experiment with your foot stance, your heel stance. You have to experiment with how you place your toes, how you do your setup, how you set your hips and your glutes on your setup. You have to sometimes experiment around to get around this. But so it's oftentimes a combination of the two, but very often it is weak hips. And the second most common thing is some sort of technique issue that's preventing you from properly engaging the glutes, even if they are strong enough. All right, next question. Steps to break through a bench press plateau, and in what order to take these steps? Well, first of all, if you're plateauing on your bench, I'm assuming you're not a novice anymore, because most novices should easily be able to get past 225 for a few reps on any good program. So first, assess your program. So assuming you're past that point, the next thing you would look at is simply eating your way to a bigger bench. And in my experience, and even chatting with other experts and people I know, and for example, I know a world champion in his federation here. It's a drug-free federation, so it's not as big. And I'm probably going to interview him at some point for you guys. And he has said that he has found that the bench press out of the 3 big lifts is the most finicky in regards to your caloric intake. That the more calories you eat, the faster your bench goes up, and the less you eat, the slower it goes up. And if you're cutting, it's the first lift to drop out. Your bench will go down faster than your squat or your deadlift when your calories aren't high enough. So there is something to be said for eating your way to a bigger bench. And I know lots of guys who were fat football players in high school who they trim down and get lean and get over it back into lifting, and sometimes they never, because they don't ever reach the same body weight, they never reach the same bench numbers they hit in high school, even though sometimes their squats or their deadlifts get higher. So there is something to be said for eating your way to a bigger bench. If your bench is stalling, you're on a good program, the first step you should do is eat more. Increase your calories. And if you're not willing to bulk harder, forget getting a big bench. You need to just forget that shit. You don't have your priorities straight. You can't get a big bench and not bulk. It's very, very rare. So the next thing you would look at, assuming you've done those things, I would only look at weak points in your bench when you're benching over, say, 275 for a couple reps. Now, when you get to that point, that's when you need to start working on things like speed strength. Because for a lot of people, getting faster off the chest, more bar speed, will give them a bigger bench no matter where their sticky point is. So that's a high priority. And then after that, you do weak point training based upon where you are sticking once you're sure you've increased your speed strength. So if it's a lockout issue, you do more tricep work and more 3 board presses, and so on and so forth. All right, last question. What are the main differences between powerlifters and strongmen and how they train? Well, it's a good question, and there's a lot of overlap. Most of the strongmen I know have either competed in powerlifting or still compete in powerlifting. But powerlifting is effectively you train for the squat, the bench, and the deadlift. And all of your training revolves around improving those 3 in some way. Whether even if you're bulking up your biceps, you make your biceps bigger by doing 10 rep sets of curls as a power lifter to give your triceps more stability on the bench press. So everything you do revolves around in some way increasing those 3 lifts. And there will always be some conditioning work. Most good power lifters do a bit of conditioning work like GPP work. But when you get over to strongman, because if you guys have seen the World's Strongest Man or any of that, that is an example of strongman events. They do things like walking carries, they carry big stones, they do farmer's walks, they do heavy overhead pressing like with torpedoes where they have to clean and press for reps. So they do a lot of overhead pressing, a lot of carried loading, a lot of deadlifting type things. They'll actually deadlift cars, and then they have to pull sometimes cars or trucks or whatever they're doing for their events. So you need not only strength training work, they might not need to train specifically the way powerlifters do to maximize those 3 lifts, but they have to focus on training all of those. But they tend to train them for a little more stamina sometimes. They do a lot of overhead pressing, a lot more than, say, powerlifters do. Now, they're still going to do a lot of deadlifting, but then they do a lot of GPP work. You'll see them doing a lot of sled drags because that carries over to these car drags and things. You'll see them doing a lot of walk-in carries. You'll see them doing a lot of farmer's walks. So those are the biggest differences in how they train versus powerlifters, even though they might do a lot of actual powerlifting training, is they do a lot more heavy GPP work for better conditioning on all those events. And they tend to focus a lot on the deadlift, and they focus a lot on overhead pressing. Alright guys, that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it has been informative, and I will talk to you next time.